Welcome in, and thanks so much for joining me. So in this episode, I'm going to be continuing my multi-part series on the three principal aspects of the path, a very well-known text in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition that covers how to regard or recognize, grow, connect with renunciation mind, bodhicitta, and the non-dual teachings on emptiness or Buddhist wisdom. So we're now, I believe, on part 6 of this series. We've already covered the verses on renunciation mind as well as on bodhicitta. And we're now going to be going into the verses talking about non-dual wisdom, otherwise known as shunyata or emptiness in Mahayana Buddhism. So quick disclaimer before we go into this. This is, what I would consider the real deep end of Sutrayana Buddhism, as well as, I don't know how to say, it can be easily misunderstood, can be challenging to understand, and can be easy to lose patience when we're trying to understand this kind of thing. It can also, we can lose track of what it actually means, right? So I'm going to do my best to try to help us navigate this topic, and more or less, I'm thinking of this as an introduction, not a comprehensive, course or class or teaching on it. Just the term emptiness, if you've never heard it before, already in English it evokes something of what we're actually not saying, right? Because often people hear the term emptiness and they just think of the empty part, meaning that the non-existent part. But the ness is actually really important as well. And so, just to go into a little bit of background, some people have suggested not using the word emptiness in English, using other terms. We're going to explore the word interdependence here, which is another term we use to teach or describe the teachings on non-dual wisdom in Mahayana Buddhism. But either way, the term emptiness is actually not so bad because it's a pretty direct translation of the Sanskrit shunyata. So shunya has this element of space, or it's not really nothingness. It's just that there's no solid, permanent, graspable essence. But the ness, or in this case, the ta, right? So shunyata in the Sanskrit, the ta aspect has this aspect that everything continues to appear. So it's not that things are nothing, but it's also not that they're something. So even within the word, and again, I'm not a Sanskrit, student, let alone teacher or professor. Even the word can have a lot of depth to it, right? So it's sort of similar to other Sanskrit terms where, we translate it, but actually usually one word in English is not going to be sufficient to describe or portray the entirety of shunyata, right? So the Tibetan word is tongpa ni, which is very similar. You have the tongpa part and the ni aspect. So emptiness, right? Not nothingness. So I just want to share that right at the beginning, so we kind of allay some of the confusion where if it starts to seem like we're talking about nihilism at some point, and we start to sort of what I call veer to the dark side, where nothing matters. Actually, it couldn't be further from the truth. Emptiness is saying everything matters because it's in relationship, it's flexible, it's malleable. It actually represents something incredibly positive in its potential, not only because from a Buddhist perspective, we would describe the underlying nature of reality as this, but also as a being experiencing that underlying nature of reality. It's where all of our potential for freedom, and I guess we could say like transformation and change, are birthed from, for lack of a better way to put it. So with that introduction, that's a little bit of a warning, because usually these teachings are reserved for people who kind of understand the basic principles of Buddhism first, and they're at less risk of more or less going in a wrong direction with these kinds of teachings. Maybe I should say a little bit more here. What does wrong direction mean? Does it mean like I don't know, you think bad of Buddhism or misrepresent it. No, I don't think. I mean, yeah, there is some kind of downside to that, but I think the Buddha doesn't really care that much unless you're, essentially trying to destroy it for other people. But what is the concern here? The concern here is that if we misunderstand this, we might fall into nihilism and actually really think nothing matters, and then then it might mix with our states of depression or anxiety, other sort of physical or mental states that can cause us to do harm to ourselves or another. That's really the risk here, right? Another risk from a Buddhist perspective, because we already talked about it in some of the previous episodes of this text, is that we deny cause and effect. We deny that the effects are in accordance with the cause, and then we stop putting attention into that. And then we have the potential to create long-term negative effects for ourselves and others, right? Of course, in the immediate, there's some danger. In the long term, we can more or less, we deny karma, cause and effect, and then we can continue to encourage behaviors and actions that will cause harm for ourselves and another. So these are the primary concerns. I guess the more immediate one, I heard a story one time. I don't know the people in this story, so I don't even know if it's true, but let's go for it. And this is a story illustrating sort of when these teachings, when they're misinterpreted, how it can go in a wrong direction. And so apparently there was a group of Westerners studying emptiness in depth with a Tibetan Buddhist teacher. And somewhere in the course or the course of studies, there was a gentleman who, non-Tibetan, someone from a Western European country, unbeknownst to anyone else, what was going on, he just sort of, one night they were having a bonfire, just enjoying, they were somewhere in nature, they were enjoying a campfire, and he just yelled, "Everything is empty," and jumped in the fire, right? And it's not really something to smile or smirk about. Fortunately, no one got hurt, I heard, and they pulled him out quickly before he got burned. But this would be like one of those examples, which to most of us sounds insane and ridiculous. And of course, I don't know what was going on with that particular person. I'm not sure how much the teachings influenced him versus just his own mental health at the time. And then you add in kind of these kinds of teachings and it pushes him over the edge. But either way, that is an illustration of what not to do, right? That's an illustration of, these teachings are not saying nothing matters, nothing exists, etc. Anyways, I think I am beating a dead horse at this point. I think you get it. I'll say one quick thing, because this can also be subtle, right? So there's lots of teachings on non-duality coming from various Indic traditions, of India and the subcontinent of India. Of course, other parts in Asia as well. And these have spread across the world. There's also all kinds of people spreading different kinds of non-dual teachings. And this is to say sort of, I don't have any judgment of those in particular, if they're different from what's being taught here in this text. I just want to point out the term non-duality now can mean a lot of different things. So fortunately, we have one of the most skillful wizards in Buddhist history, which is Lama Tsongkhapa, who's the author of the text we are using as the base for our Dharma discussion today. Lama Tsongkhapa was extremely skillful, using language to cut through the distinction of what are we really talking about here? What are we referring to as non-dual wisdom in Buddhism? And as you'll see, as we progress through the verses, it gets more and more specific to the point where, it's easy to lose track of what he's actually saying, because we have to know something about emptiness already, the teachings on non-dual wisdom in Buddhism already, to interpret what he's saying. But either way, that's what we're here to do. We're here to walk through it. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the verse. And then, this is just such a big topic. So really, this particular episode is to kind of introduce this to people who are new to this concept. For those of you who've heard it before, hopefully kind of like refresh, maybe give you some new perspectives. And then the following verses we'll cover in other episodes are going to go deeper into it. So with that said, we're on verse 9. And so verse 9 goes like this. If you lack the wisdom that realizes the nature of things, although you might grow accustomed to renunciation and bodhicitta, you will be incapable of cutting through conditioned existence at its root. Exert yourself, therefore, in the methods for realizing interdependence. Great. So already we're hearing this term interdependence as an analogy, as another way to describe the non-dual teachings on emptiness in Mahayana Buddhism. And I'm most likely going to take that angle because interdependence is a wonderful way to not only deepen one's understanding of these teachings, but it's also a way in. Because when we're talking about interdependence, we're not talking about nothingness. So right away, it can sort of cut through that misunderstanding. But we're also not talking about something that exists in a solid, permanent, unchanging way. Why? Because it's in relationship and it's dependent upon parts. So this is going to come up a little bit more as we progress in future episodes. But for now, I just want to start to seed that. But let's go back to the beginning of the verse a little bit. And so those of you who've been following along since I started this series, you're going to recognize, what he's referring to here as renunciation and bodhicitta as preliminaries for the path, or not really preliminaries, they're principles, right? So we have the three principles, which are renunciation, bodhicitta, and emptiness, or the view. And as you've seen in some of the previous verses, by the way, if you haven't seen any of the episodes, feel free to, go ahead and go watch them or listen to them if you're on Spotify or another iTunes, whatever you listen to. But either way, as we saw in some of the previous verses, when we were being introduced to bodhicitta, Lama Tsongkhapa was alluding to the necessity for renunciation mind to be developed. And now he's saying we need both renunciation and bodhicitta, to really be free to awaken on this path of Buddha Dharma. But we also, we need emptiness. And without emptiness, it's sort of incomplete, right? So that's why there's three principles here instead of one or two, etc. And once you study this more and you reflect on it, you can really see how it comes together here. And I'll briefly kind of summarize to help us do that. So renunciation mind is basically becoming exhausted with the status quo of how we suffer, right? And suffering here, as we explored in some of the previous episodes, it doesn't just refer to gross physical and emotional pain. It can refer to just the existential quality of life itself, which a lot of times people initially take that to be very pessimistic in Buddhism. But if you actually look a little bit deeper, it's actually a teaching on compassion. Why is it a teaching on compassion? Because it's a teaching on looking at our own experience and looking at how the nature of things play out, mainly through this window of what we call dukkha, right? So dukkha is a term in Sanskrit and Pali that represents, it's translated as suffering, it's translated as dissatisfaction, it can be translated many ways because it refers to many different types of life experience, right? And it's not pessimistic. It's actually showing where we are getting caught, where we are getting stuck in, or I guess you could say kind of we're getting in our own way, how to recognize that. And then, of course, the Buddha goes into teaching how to remedy that, how to get out of that stagnation, which most importantly is what we're actually starting to talk about here in verse 9. But either way, if that's not recognized, it's going to be very difficult to want to be free because we're going to continually look towards avenues or ways of being or ways of thinking or acting or whatever to achieve some kind of lasting happiness that actually don't provide it. So I usually refer to this as sort of seeking a throughway in a dead end. So the renunciation mind teachings, they're a lot about doing enough reflection. Of course, studying the Dharma helps. That's why we're talking about this, because it gives ways to reflect. I'll repeat it again, as I love to repeat this. This is not about belief. This is not about you reading this and being like, oh, the Buddha is so great. I believe this now. It's useful, but it's not that useful. We actually have to take the teaching, reflect on it, check it, analyze it, be skeptical to a certain degree. And we have to be honest with ourselves. We have to check it against our own experience. And from there, we're going to start to see some truth, some kernels of truth. Not, we might not see a lot in the beginning. It takes time, but you see enough. And then you keep pursuing and pursuing. And then we use meditation to actually open up this process, which I will say is not the funnest process for most of us, because we need to look more at the problem initially. And it's very similar to a doctor where we're having a certain physical problem. We go see a doctor. What's a doctor going to do? They're going to ask us more about the problem. They're going to have us talk about it in a deeper way, try to understand it. They're going to run tests to try to figure out what's going on. So it's very similar. We need to actually go deeper into the problem with compassion, with love, right? What does love mean? It means we want ourselves to be happy. We want ourselves and others to be happy. Compassion, we want ourselves and others to be free from suffering. That's the whole reason we're doing this. I don't know about you. I don't do this to be smart. I mean, maybe at some time I did early on, but these days I'm not that interested in that. I do this because I want to be free. I want to be a more open being towards myself and others. I don't want to get caught in my thoughts and emotions all the time. I don't want to continually create destructive karma, right? So there's some element of like, oh, okay, we need to understand the predicament deeper in order to then grow the wish and also solution for remedying it. So that's all the renunciation mind stuff. Now, bodhicitta is that plus we're actually starting to recognize we can, how do you say it? Based on our freedom, based on us working towards that, we can influence others. Influence here is I'm choosing that word today. It's maybe not the best word. Influence here doesn't mean being an influencer. It doesn't mean having a YouTube channel or, popular social medias. It actually means living as an example for others of what a free being looks like, right? And for a lot of us, myself included, this is a process of aspiration. It's not something that happens quickly. It's not like, oh, I'm a free being now, and then suddenly, no. Our habits and behaviors, as you know, are way thicker than that. They take way much more time to work with and work out through meditation and the path. Hence why we have all these practices around these three principles, right? But either way, aspiration is important. I want to do that. I don't want to just sort of free myself and then, go sit on a cloud somewhere. I actually want to help others. I want the world to be a more peaceful place, right? But does it work to sort of influence others in an aggressive way to try to, do I have any control of them at all is, I think, a valid question. And how much can I influence through the relative means of the world? And more or less, you can see in the life story of the Buddha, as well as many, many other enlightened beings, how they attained enlightenment and what happened. They showed they became awake and they were an awake being. And then others saw that, maybe some didn't see that. Obviously, there's stories of the Buddha where certain people didn't see that. And like I think it's his cousin, Devadatta. Anyways, you can go look up those stories. But the point is, there's a different vibe to that kind of a person. No, I don't know your background or where you're coming from or how atheists or religious you are. It actually doesn't matter. It's wherever you're coming from is fine. But I'll just describe some of my experience. I don't know. I don't know why. I guess it's just because I've pursued this kind of path. But I feel quite fortunate, not because I've gotten anywhere with it or I'm anything special, but I feel quite fortunate to have met beings that I don't know 100%, but did feel like to me they were awake to a certain degree. Were they enlightened? I have no idea. Are they enlightened? I don't know. But they're different, right? So for instance, when I became a monk, I had some time to meet the Dalai Lama, very brief. That was one of those examples. It was like being in a force field where you're just like, what is going on? Also, some other of my teachers, various Buddhist teachers who are very accomplished, who I've met over the years. And to me, that says more sometimes than what a book or text can say, or some dude on YouTube, i.e. me. So sometimes we have to get out of our house and actually try to meet some of these people because they exist. We're actually so fortunate because, they still exist. I think I was blown away from the first time I met Lama Zopa Rinpoche, my first main teacher. I was just like, wow, someone like this exists. Because it was not just words. It was his whole being was compassion and wisdom. So anyways, so that's to say, us, mainly me here, we can make aspirations towards that, and then we work along the path. But if we're never recognizing and working with our own predicament, it's going to be very difficult to develop any kind of wider compassion for others' predicament, because we're just not going to understand it, or we're going to have a very small view of it, right? So bodhicitta, based on renunciation mind, is just this wide view of mind, emotions, heart, body, life. And it just widens as we reflect and meditate. Then, our point today, we get to the teachings on emptiness, which are the teachings on actually how to recognize the nature of how things are. This is one thing that I continually come back to. I'll kind of share this with you all, whoever's watching, listening to this. You might not know this about me. I'm pretty allergic to religion. And it's kind of strange for a guy who has a kind of like a Buddhist, YouTube channel and where I teach meditation, Buddhism, etc. And, also I do classes and all kinds of stuff. But I have a pretty big allergy to religion. Some of that maybe is like helpful sometimes. Some of that is harmful, where I might, find myself kind of avoiding certain situations that probably are good for me. But either way, that allergy continually points me back to these teachings on the wisdom of emptiness, because fundamentally what these teachings on interdependence or emptiness, whatever term we want to use, shunyata, are saying is we're not actually trying to believe and or find something outside of ourselves. We're not actually seeking a religious dogma and trying to force ourselves into it or brainwashing ourselves into it. What we tend to do, of course, we study the teachings so we can kind of like aim in the right direction, but mainly we use meditation to explore the mind, to explore our own emotions, to explore our thoughts, to explore our sense perceptions, how we perceive ourselves in the world, and we become a scientist of that. Of course, it's subjective in that sense, but either way, we become a scientist of our own internal experience through meditation, through the insight we gain through studying the Dharma and reflecting on it. And the idea here is that emptiness is not, first of all, it's not something findable, but it's the kind of essence of everything. And so it's not saying you need to believe something and then experience it. It's saying what happens when we pull things away? What happens in meditation when we see more and more of how things are? We're not attaining something, we're removing what's in the way of seeing how something is. So this is very, sometimes we use analogies like, the wetness of water, or the nature, heat, the nature of fire is to be hot, etc. Right? So these kinds of things, it's not like you can say the wetness of water is findable, right? It's just sort of, that's the nature of what water is. Of course, it can become frozen in ice, and in that moment, we can't see its wetness, but it's there. Its potential is there. The essence of the wetness is still there. So these are some analogies we kind of use, and they're helpful for me because it's not like you also can't separate the water from its wetness. So that's a whole other thing. And the wetness doesn't impede the water's activity, like what it needs to do, how it needs to function. Again, another way to think about in emptiness, we're not talking about nothingness, but we're also not talking about somethingness. We're not also talking about something that exists in the way it appears. But either way, getting back to the point in the text here, we need to study, reflect, meditate on emptiness. Otherwise, we can't cut the root of dukkha and cut the root of karma and all of the bondage of what we call samsara in Buddhism. And therefore, from a bodhicitta perspective, we're not going to be able to help others much, right? I'm open to debate on that, because of course we can help others in relative ways. This is talking about removing the causes of suffering completely, right? Which I will say, with my my allergy to religion, it is a religious. We have to admit this is a philosophical view. Though when you start to study and practice this more, it ceases to be. That's kind of what I'm saying, right? We actually start to gain more appreciation and more, I guess you could say, belief based on experience, which is the whole point. But sometimes we need to start with just sort of like, oh, that sounds interesting. I like that. And then we kind of go. And then we see if it's true. That's the whole point here. So the verse says, although you might grow accustomed to renunciation and bodhicitta, you will be incapable of cutting through conditioned existence at its root. So root here means the root of how we're perceiving ourselves and others. So this is where it gets into, deep territory in Buddhist philosophy, where the belief is, because I'll just talk about it as a belief for now, is that our suffering, our dukkha, our life proliferates from a belief in an independent self and an independent other, right? Anything that we don't believe to be self. And that is an illusion from a Buddhist perspective. Again, just to caveat this, the illusion doesn't mean non-existent. Illusion means illusion, right? So for instance, often in the traditional Buddhist teachings, like a magician's trick, right, is used as an analogy or metaphor for this. That a magician can show you that a bird disappeared, or whatever the trick is, right? And that itself is the illusion, right? So it seems that he made something happen that was outside the realms of physics, but it was sort of a sleight of hand, a play. And so we use that as a metaphor for life, essentially, that things can happen and appear, but they're also interdependent. They're not solid. They're not truly existent. And they kind of are a little bit like a magician's trick. But the rub here is there's no magician. It's like no one's actually doing that except for our own mind. Another analogy I really like is the analogy of a firebrand. So if we have a stick of fire and then we move it around quick enough, right? I'm sure many of you have tried this or seen this. It appears that there's a circle of fire, but there's not a circle of fire. It's just dependent upon the cause and effect of doing this with a stick on fire, right? But it's actually one stick. It's not a circle, right? It's not a ring of fire. So this is kind of examples we use to describe illusion. One of my favorites is the example of dreaming and dreams, right? So here, the example basically refers to the reality of last night's dream, whether we're having a good dream or a bad dream. When we wake up from a vivid dream, it just seems so real. And then, it takes us 5-10 seconds and we realize, oh, I'm in my bed and it's Monday morning or whatever. I got to get up and do my things. But it just felt so real. We were in this whole world and universe in our minds that was just thoughts, just ideas, more or less, right? Of course, images and everything. And so the Buddha used that analogy to also talk about life, right? Now, is our physical life the same as a dream? No, but we're using it as an analogy. It's something that appears, but is illusory, right? And permanent, impermanent and changing. Okay? So this is what it means to cut through conditioned existence, because all of this is conditioned, right? Conditions just meaning, two things coming together or two things or more to meet, and then it creates another circumstance. So we can start to see here when we're using the word conditioned or interdependent, we're alluding to something that is not non-existent, right? It still functions, it still appears, but it's actually made up of all kinds of different conditions, causes, parts. I'm going to probably use the word relationships a little bit more because it's a little more direct. It's made up of all different relationships, and then it can appear to be one thing, but it's actually many things. And then those many things break down even further. So either way, this is what cuts the root. What they mean by root is the root of self-clinging, right? And the root of clinging to an independently or truly existent objective world. This is what cuts the root and allows us to be free. So it says, exert yourself, therefore, in the methods for realizing interdependence. We could also just say emptiness right there. Exert yourself, therefore, in the methods for realizing emptiness. And this is really key, and this is the last thing I'll say. This is not just an idea or a nice belief we adopt. It can start as a nice idea. It can start as something, wow, that's interesting. That kind of makes sense, or maybe doesn't make sense, but I like it. And then we pursue it. But actually, we need to realize it, because that's what actually cuts the root. An idea is not enough. A conceptual belief is not enough. We need to see directly. The mind needs to see directly how things are. And that happens through, for most of us, through a lot of meditation, right? And then, of course, there's many styles of how to meditate on emptiness, depending on whether it's Sutra or Tantra. So there's many styles, there's many ways to do it. But either way, that is how we cut the root, and that has to become an experience, a realization that's incontrovertible, not just sort of a nice idea or belief. So I think I'm gonna end it there. This is just really an introduction to all of this. I was just looking at some notes to see if there's anything else I want to say here. Yeah, I think we're good. So more or less, now we're really getting into the teachings on, okay, I understand like where the predicament is. I can see it to a certain degree. I can see it's not just me, it's others who are experiencing this. That's the bodhicitta part, right? We're developing compassion, loving kindness, a wish to be free for the benefit of ourselves and others. Now, how do we do it? That's from verse 9 on. So thanks so much for joining me again. I really appreciate you. As always, feel free to comment here on YouTube if you're watching, if you're listening on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube Music, somewhere else. Feel free to reach out to me at scottdusa.com. And if you haven't already, please go check out the other episodes, podcasts, videos, I already said. I also often turn these into blog posts for my website. I also have a newsletter where, you don't have to go searching for things. I just send it to you. So you can check all that out on my website, scottdusa.com. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.